This is Tom Fox, or at least a disembodied voice of Tom Fox, as you look at Neil Swidey. Neil is the author of Under the Sea,
Trapped Under the Sea.
Trapped Under the Sea, and he and I were speaking at a conference today in Boston, and he graciously took some time to visit with me. For those who remember the earlier podcast, I interviewed him about his book, but he gave a talk today that really had some great concepts that apply to both safety, anti-corruption compliance, and really all forms of compliance. So, Neil, thank you very much for agreeing to come back for another interview.
My pleasure. I always enjoy talking with you.
Okay. You said some things this morning that I thought just had some great insights. And the first one I want to ask you about is the concept that the Swiss cheese has to line up.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
So I think when there's a huge catastrophic failure, there's often an impulse to look for a big, massive screw-up, a singular failure that led to this horrible outcome. And what I found in my research in Trapped Under the Sea, but also what I found in researching a lot of other mistakes and big problems and fatalities and horrible outcomes, is that it's never one big failure. It's often a series of small mistakes, any one of which would not be enough to cause this catastrophic outcome. But it's when they align in a cruel way that the analogy is the holes in the Swiss cheese line up. And when that happens, that's when all those levels of protection that would guard against this bad thing happening aren't there. They're gone. And the consequence of this is it's much easier if you're running an organization to prepare for and avoid the massive singular failures than it is to take seriously and prevent the small things that could line up to create this bad outcome. Because it only happens when that cascading effect happens when all those things line up. So there might be lots of projects out there where we could have had a fatality or a horrible outcome, but for one thin layer of cheese that's protecting us from that.
Right. Another concept I heard you talk about is the difference between a policy of quality or a policy of safety or a policy of compliance with really a culture of compliance. Could you talk about that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think what I learned from in the book has to do with commercial divers who were sent on this mission, this incredible mission to the end of this unventilated 10-mile-long tunnel underneath the ocean. But what I learned from the field of commercial divers, whether these are working on oil rigs or other jobs out there, is there's often a policy called stop work or all stop policy, which means anyone at any level of the organization, if they see something that doesn't look right, that could lead to a fatality or a bad outcome, they can stop a job. It could be the lowest tender, the lowest worker on the job, or it could certainly be a senior person. But what I also found is that many companies have that policy, but they don't have a culture for that. And that means that the culture comes in the moments of tension, in the moments of struggle, in the moments of the pressure coming down and money on the table and an unforgiving calendar that's they're calling for deadlines to be met. And in those moments, if someone stops a job and that person is not seen as an annoyance and sort of pushed away, but is actually appreciated for having stopped a potential disastrous outcome, those are the moments when a policy becomes a culture, because the workers sense that, they see that, and they see if, hey, this is what happened to Joe or Susan when she or he stopped a job. Was it a good story or a bad story? And there are companies out there that have both those, and I think, unfortunately, more have the policy rather than the culture.
In fact, you gave the example of one of the divers you wrote about on another job where he felt something was unsafe, raised that concern, and as you explained it, the safety issue was not resolved. He was moved to another part of the job.
Yeah, he was. It was a. They made it go away, and they made him go away. They didn't fire him, but they put him out of the way. So he raised a safety issue, and they said it's almost as though the safety issue only applied to him. We'll move you out of the way and not really address the problem, and then we don't have to worry about someone stopping, being a squeaky wheel on this. Um, but that has enormous consequences, because on that job, that was the basis for this company, and this engineer was the project manager for getting the next job, which is the center of the book, um, which had that outcome on there. And if the same employer in both cases, and same subcontractor, but if they had seen, if the employer, the main contractor, had known about that, I think they might not have hired the same company or made sure there were other provisions in place. So that was a telling issue, how you handle it in a moment of stress.
One of the other things I heard you talk about this morning is the difference in raw intelligence, or you termed it IQ, with emotional intelligence, and particularly that in the role of a leader. And later on, I heard you say the difference in a transactional person and a relationship person. Can you talk about that a little bit for us?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something I've grown to appreciate more. And I look back at my interactions over the years with colleagues and managers and direct reports and that kind of thing. And you understand, you appreciate that a lot of times we're raised through schools to think, oh, the smartest one in the class is the one you want on your team. And yes, you do want smart people thinking creatively about how to solve issues. But if you're a team leader, if you're a manager, more important than that is pulling the best out of people on your team. And it's amazing, especially in certain fields, engineering and others, that become very sort of linear, sort of yes and no, black and white, that there are a lot of people who rise to levels of authority, who have very high IQs but don't have very high emotional intelligence. And that's very dangerous, actually, because as I show in the book, it can have disastrous outcomes, or it can just have less disastrous but still significant outcomes in a negative way on performance of the company. People respond to other human beings, and the people who can read other human beings and know how to get the most out of them are the people who have more successful teams and more successful operations. And I think we need to know, when we put people in key positions, do they know how to get the most out of those people who are working with them? Because if they don't, if they cite their role in the org chart and I'm in charge, you don't have to think about this, I've thought this through, which happened in this case, what that does is denies everyone the kind of sum total of the experience and all those sets of eyes on how a job is to prevent something bad from happening. If it's just the leader who's the only one who's getting any information because no one feels that they're going to be respected if they give that information, then it's not going to go well.
Right. One of the things you talked about early on in your presentation was, let's see if I wrote this down right, the farther away you are from a risky decision, the more likely you are to tolerate risk. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. So in business schools, they call this, I think, distancing. You know, the idea that if you're a manager on a job and you've got 5 people on your team, and there's some kind of discussion about whether someone will have to do some work, you might assess the risks involved in that and say yes or no based on that. But if it moves down to not the people who are your direct reports, but a subcontractor that you're hiring, or a sub to a sub,
right,
you're more likely to tolerate higher risk from the sub and the sub to the sub than you are from your own people. Why is that? It's because you think, one, accountability, there's some distance from you and this risky behavior, but also this, you don't really think about the people who actually have to do the job 2 layers away from you. And to the extent that you think about Roger and Anne-Marie and others on your team, and you know their kids and other things, and sort of like it's real when it's in front of you, it's less real the farther it gets from you. But that's dangerous, because if things go bad, it's coming back to you. And I think managers just have to realize that.
Right. You did. I didn't appreciate the wealth of research you did for your book, looking at a large number of different industries and certainly interviews with a huge number of people. But I think one of the things you talked about was researching with NASA and how NASA looks at its failures and how it really uses those failures. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, in some ways, my book is about a group of workers who were sent to the subterranean black hole 10 miles into the Earth. Um,
You even called it working on the moon.
It was, and that wasn't the first one. Some of the people on this job essentially said this is akin to a spacewalk. There's no air down there, no breathable air. There's no way out except a very treacherous way back through a 10-mile long tunnel. We have to understand that that's what this is like and think about that in that way. And so I decided to go to NASA because who knows high-risk missions better than NASA at the edge of civilization in a way,
Right.
Or beyond in their case. And I found from them fascinating behaviors. One, as you say, that they learn more from the Challenger than they learned from their successful shuttle launchers over the years. What went wrong? And they, because they're at this high-risk sort of space that they work in, no pun intended, they have to make sure they understand how things work. And so with the Challenger case, they understood that people at different levels knew about these O-rings that were going to go bad. But two things happened. One, there was this pressure to go and to move forward on this, the first teacher in space and other things. There was a lot of external pressures that pushed that mission forward on there. Another thing was presentation. There was actually things weren't presented graphically correctly to the managers to sort of see what was actually happening here. In a clear way on here, so that presentation and communicating of risk and risk assessment is sometimes as important as detecting the risk involved in with is how you get that through. And one last thing that I learned a lot from talking about both the astronauts but also the psychiatrists and psychologists,
Right.
Who have enormous sway in the composition of teams at NASA. And that's, they look for different skills than we might think when you're putting together a team. You're not looking for a cookie cutter of all the same kind of people, but you are looking for how people respond to stressful situations, how they manage their resources in those moments of high stress. And so they assemble these teams very carefully, and then, crucially, they give them time to get to know each other.
Right.
And that's to be able to anticipate. If you or I are on the same team, I should know exactly what you're going to do with your left hand or your right hand in a moment of crisis before you even do it, before I even have to say anything about it, because those seconds become the only barrier between life and death in those kind of key moments. So NASA anticipates those moments of high risk, high stress, and they prepare for them. And time and understanding of human nature and how small organizations or big organizations perform or take on enormous importance to the betterment of the mission.
One of the things that surprised me that you talked about this morning was really the lack of time that the commercial divers involved in the incident had to spend together. And coming from Houston in the energy industry, I've known several commercial divers, and my sense was that they worked as a team, but that was not true in this situation.
Yeah, well, this case, there was so much pressure on this massive project, and where the main contractor was getting fined $30,000 a day for every day it was late, and they were 5 years late at this point on here. And people needed something to happen, and they ended up putting two small subcontractors together to tell them to work on the job. So that aggravated all the other issues about this, because they didn't get that time to gel as a team, to be able to become a kind of unified force, both in terms of how they acted and responded to stress, but also how they communicated if they didn't feel certain things were ready for prime time on a job. And they all had those feelings, but because they hadn't worked with each other, they couldn't be a kind of put a unified front as well. All those things matter, and they matter importantly on there. So in certain fields, there are often people who work for different companies and kind of move around. In diving, they call it same hat, different job, or other things like that. I may have gotten that wrong, but it's the idea of your employer may change, but you're doing the same kinds of things and sometimes with the same people. But if you're asked to take on a job that no one's ever done before,
As
as
this
the case
was.
this was, nothing like it had ever been attempted, you need to make sure the people on your team uh, know who they're dealing with.
At the end of the day, it seems like what you wrote about and what your book is about people. The men who went down this tunnel, the men who ordered them down this tunnel. And really, you fleshed out what these men were about, who they were, who their families were, and you really drove home the story of decisions have consequences. Corporate decisions have consequences. Is that one of the things you started to try to tell, or did it evolve that way?
That definitely evolved. Basically, I started this idea with this book with the question, which is how do very smart people make very bad decisions that have very serious consequences, in this case, worker deaths. Because it's not evil people out there who are callously sort of indifferent to other people's lives. What I found is people generally trying to do a good job under stressful situations, but often not connecting their actions with downstream what happens and who has to absorb those risks. There's a lot of pushing risks off to other parties, and at the end of the day, somebody has to absorb those risks, and often it's the workers on the front line. And if we're asking people to do these incredible jobs that make this modern civilization infrastructure possible, that we all benefit from, we owe it to them to make sure that we've thought through those things and not just push the risk onto their shoulders.
I asked you earlier this morning what was some of the more interesting or unusual things that come out because of this book, and you told me about a letter you received. It was an incredibly moving story. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's been really wonderful to hear the reaction to people because everyone sort of responds to different parts of the story. I think I mentioned to you certain engineers who were involved in the story have said every young engineer coming out should have to read this, or everyone in management should have to read this kind of story because it puts a human face to this idea of decisions have consequences, real life consequences. But this letter that I mentioned to you was just kind of blew me away. I didn't expect this one at all. And the first line was, "You don't know me, but you saved my marriage." And it was about a woman who was married for a long time to a commercial diver, and she said quite candidly that the marriage was on its last legs because her husband was distant and she was tired of both the physical distance that was involved in his career, but the emotional distance as well. And she just didn't. And then she read this book. Someone had given it to her, and she had this sort of new insight into what workers like her husband were being asked to do. Not in the particulars of this case, but in general, being asked to work on these really high-risk jobs that most of us don't really even think about and certainly don't appreciate to the extent that we should. And all the stress that is kind of embedded in that life that someone doing that work naturally brings home with them. And she said, I got in the car, my husband was on a job 4.5 hours away, and I stopped at his favorite donut place and got a dozen donuts, and I started driving as soon as I finished the book, and I showed up at his job site, which I'd never done before, and I gave him a kiss, and I said, I love you here. And she said it was, and to me that was just, this beautiful moment. You have no idea, you can never anticipate something like that, but that I hope what people get from this is being able to inhabit other people's worlds a little bit, and also to look at the world a little differently around us and to appreciate this modern infrastructure that we all benefit from, and to connect it with the human beings who make that possible, and again, often at incredible risk to themselves.
One of the other things you talked about was the redevelopment of the city of Boston, redevelopment of the harbor, the coastal communities that have grown up really since the harbor has been cleaned up. And it's just been a fantastic story, not only ecological, but also economic. And then if I could bring it back down to these divers were paid $700 a day. So that seems to drive home your point precisely.
Yeah, and that was a good payday for them when that was happening on it for a 2-week job on it. But it was incredibly small money when you think about what they were asked to do and the enormous sacrifice and risk that they had to take on to bail out some very uh, brilliant engineers and designers and contractors, some of the world's best and brightest minds who had kind of put this engineering marvel that transformed Boston Harbor from the filthiest harbor in America to its cleanest urban harbor and made all this revitalization possible. But when they were in a jam, those best and brightest minds, they turned to workers, and these workers were intrigued, I think, by being able to make history in their field, by getting a decent, for their field, payday for a few weeks. But never, I think, did anyone have the full appreciation for what they were being asked to do. And that's what's so tragic about that if people had thought that through more, and I hope when people read the book that they apply this to other contexts and think more through when risk is involved, who's being asked to do it, and we owe it to them to make sure that we've thought through things that we can think through and not just pushed it on their shoulders.
Now, one of the other things I learned from your talk this morning was that the work that these individual divers were doing was in response to an applied safety issue that brought unintended consequences that people hadn't thought about. What was the secondary effect of the safety issue? So I think one of the things I got was your request for people to really think through the consequences of their decision.
Absolutely, and that safety is not always, a safety measure is not always an improvement. Safety and thinking about safety is always beneficial and always essential to what we're doing. But just because something is labeled a safety measure, it doesn't mean it's going to improve safety, which is kind of a contrary thing. You think,
Right.
well, any level of protection, if you're running a carnival and you have 3 inspectors rather than 2 checking the rides, that's got to be better, right? Well, that probably is better because you have different eyes on this. But the example I mentioned this morning was when ironworkers first got in,
Right.
and they used to die falling off these high elevations. Someone said, well, let's tie them with a rope. And that helped initially. But then the workers started dying of being choked to death because of the rope. Until people moved to the harness and realized, okay, we can improve upon this. At the key of this story that I write about, and the irony of it is, it was an additional level, a secondary or a 3rd level safety measure that the people in charge put in place to protect worker lives that ended up introducing a level of risk to worker lives, ultimately a driver of worker fatalities, that didn't exist before the safety measure was introduced. So I think that's sobering for people in safety to think through everything they do. It's not just people outside of safety that have to listen to and think through safety, it's people in safety that too as well.
Well, Neil, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with me. It was a fascinating talk, and I hope my listeners have enjoyed yet another visit with you.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you.